1936, is likely to look back with nostalgia to the time before the age of dictators, when nationality, culture, human relations, and even happiness itself had not yet been redefined in terms of ideology. I never knew the Hungary of my family, but I preserved an imprint of it from their memories and the diaries they kept, and I have done what justice I could to the past in a recently published memoir with the title Fault Lines. Gustav Springer, 1842 to 1920, enters the history books as a successful industrialist in the final creative decades of the Habsburg Empire. Acting on a maxim, Grund fliegt nimmer weg, meaning that real estate cannot fly away, he bought property in Central Europe. He spent 6 months of the year in the house that has become the municipal offices of Kapuvar. The racehorses that were his pride and joy were bred and trained in the stud at nearby Leshvar. His daughter Mitzi, my grandmother, 1886 to 1978, lived in Pokvar, more a mansion than a house, set in woods not far from Győr. In her eyes, Hungarians could do little wrong. That was for the Czechs to do. She spoke the language, and so did her only son, Max, my uncle. He organized annual partridge shoots, and once on the Pushta had stalked and shot a bustard, and then had the bird stuffed and mounted to display its giant wingspan. Poppy, Mitzi's daughter and my mother, liked to reminisce about gypsy music, dancing, clothes, and Pishta, the faithful retainer who had cared for her and her younger sister. At Pokvar in 1938, Alan, my father, already a published writer, was noting in his diary that he was contemplating, quote, early retirement into an eccentric Hungarian country life. In the war, the Gestapo laid hands on Mitzi's possessions in Austria, and after the war, the communists laid hands on her possessions behind the Iron Curtain. Real estate, it turned out, could fly away. These were facts of life. Totalitarian orders were doing what they had been set up to do. Conscripted for military service, I found myself stationed in Germany in 1955. When I had leave, I went to Vienna. The Russians had signed the treaty that ended their zone of occupation, but fear of what they might do next was in the air. The house in which I had been born was war-damaged, soon to be disposed of. One day that summer, my company commander drove me to have a look at the Iron Curtain. There we were, staring through field glasses across an open field, when firing burst out on the far side of the fence with its watchtowers and barbed wire. A deer came crashing through the undergrowth, but I well understood that the border guards would have made sure to shoot dead any would-be escaper. I was in barracks back in England in July 1956, when Colonel Gamal Abdul Nasser sprang the surprise of nationalizing the Suez Canal. Accepting Soviet financing for a new Aswan dam, Nasser was adopting a communist position against Western interests. Of course, I knew nothing about the high politics evolving behind the scene. Orders for my regiment to go to Egypt were abruptly cancelled, and I was given permission to go up to Magdalen College, Oxford. Government policy was shifting unmistakably towards armed intervention in Egypt, and angry demonstrations against it were staged day after day in the center of Oxford. The university had long since been a stronghold of the left. The dominant topic of intellectual discourse in the colleges and the tutorials was where the line should be drawn between communism and socialism. The use of force was the unresolved question. Equality was held to be the foremost social good, from the communist point of view so desirable that force, in whatever degree is necessary, is justified to implement it. Clearly incompatible with equality, liberty was seen as a secondary good, too close to capitalist privilege for comfort, and so, perhaps, not a good at all. The popular writer Sándor Márai, in his memoir, has a telling little anecdote about the difficulty communists have with liberty. He spent the end of the war deep in the Hungarian countryside, and when Soviet soldiers first came through where he was, he understood that they couldn't give him any liberty because they had none for themselves. In short, they were not liberators, but occupiers. Behind the scenes, this time in Moscow in February 1956, Nikita Khrushchev, the ebullient General Secretary, had taken advantage of the 20th Party Congress to criticize Stalin for resorting regularly to much too high a degree of force. Supposedly secret, it was risky for Khrushchev, in so many words, to be conceding that thanks to Gulag and the post-1945 occupation of the countries of the Soviet bloc, communism in reality was a criminal enterprise. One, moreover, which incriminated him, as well as all the party delegates in the hall. However, the Kremlin was facing varying degrees of dissent, rioting, and political demonstrations in Marshal Tito's Yugoslavia and throughout the Soviet bloc. Filtering to the outer world through party channels, Khrushchev's address was a necessary and sufficient cause of the Hungarian Uprising. On October the 3rd, the Times of London had a prediction wide of the mark. Quote, "Hungary faces a dismal autumn and winter in the face of the twin evils of a poor harvest and a grave fuel shortage." Not a word about the struggle between the outgoing Matyas Rákosi and his high degree of force cohort, or the rehabilitated Imre Nagy and his renounce of force cohort. Without any preliminary reporting, the Times at last brought the story up to date on October the 24th. Quote, "Tens of thousands of Hungarian university students, workers and soldiers made a demonstration in the center of Budapest today, shouting, 'Out with the Russian troops,' and 'We want a new government with Imre Nagy.'" Deadpan, the report concludes, later the crowd tried unsuccessfully to pull down a 20-foot statue of Stalin. Suddenly, unexpectedly, dramatic events were breaking the lock the Cold War had imposed on the balance of power between the United States and the Soviet Union. If Washington held that the Hungarians were in the right, would it support them in word, or better still, deed? And if so, how, and with what? What would or should Khrushchev and the Politburo decide? If it was wrong for the British to use force in their own interests, how could it be right for the Soviets to use force in their own interests? The communist faction in my college went into a huddle to thrash out this dilemma. I felt that I did not have an informed opinion about the rights and wrongs that Nasser was raising, but I had no doubt of the moral injunction to support the Hungarians. A small number of the more adventurous did go out to Budapest, and one of them, Robert Oakeshott, nephew of the political philosopher Michael Oakeshott, is said to have addressed a large crowd at Sopron and holed up at one point with General Maleta in the Kilian barracks. Godfrey Mennel is the only Englishman, I am sure, actually fought with a weapon in his hand. He belonged to a select minority of adventurers who'd been educated at Eton College, a school for the privileged. He actually fought with a weapon in his hand, perhaps emulating his father, who in the 1930s had won a posthumous Victoria Cross on the northwest frontier, Taliban country nowadays. At Cambridge, Dr. Noel Moynihan organized a charity, Aid to Hungary, recruiting some 20 helpers to attract and distribute aid from quarters in a monastery on the Austrian side of the frontier. Imre Nagy did not at first appear to have the stuff of heroes. Along with other foreign communists, he had spent the war years in Moscow, in the Lux Hotel, that antechamber of the Lubyanka. Evidently, Khrushchev, General Ivan Serov, the senior secret policeman present in Budapest, and Yuri Andropov, the future General Secretary of the Soviet Communist Party, and at that time an attaché in the Soviet embassy, engaged in mashkirovka, the classic Russian game of covering the traces of some foul deed. In a series of broken promises, ambushes and kidnappings, they arrested Noj, Maleta, and a dozen others, now destined to be spirited away to Romania for a kangaroo trial and judicial execution. As sporadic fighting petered out, Julius High, formerly a communist playwright, as eminent as Bertolt Brecht, earned another measure of international fame with his appeal on the radio, repeating the cry of "help" 6 times. Like Sándor Márai earlier, like every Hungarian, he had come face to face with armed occupiers pretending to be liberators. Leaving the studio after the broadcast, he writes in his autobiography, Born 1900, quote, "Out in the corridor, we saw the first Soviet soldiers coming round the corner." Moscow radio made its pitch on November the 5th. This morning, the forces of reactionary conspiracy against the Hungarian people were crushed. In a letter dated November the 8th and published in the collection of his correspondence with the title Enlightening Letters 1946 to 1960, Isaiah Berlin records that I had thoughts of leaving as a volunteer for Hungary. A highly influential personality, not just in Oxford, but in the wider intellectual world, he was professor of social and political theory. I was free to call on him at will, because my mother had been a lifelong friend of his wife, née Aline de Gainsbourg. Quote, "Hungary is a very romantic cause," he wrote, with a lightly dismissive touch. "All sorts of young men want to go there and die for liberty, although plainly they cannot be of any use now that the Russians have crushed the resistance." End of quote. "My instinct was good," he allowed, "but not to be indulged." Quote again, "One must not take oneself so seriously. One must just carry on with whatever one is doing without feeling that the safety and happiness of the world depends upon one's position." At the time, I did not keep a diary, and so I cannot exactly date my movements, but I went to Vienna at the start of the Easter vacation of 1957. There I stayed with Dr. Hans Meiler Pokorny, who had been my grandmother's man of business before the war, and who had become an angry pessimist. Also living in the apartment was Dieter, a relation of his in his early 20s, who had just escaped from Hungary and was plainly in a state of shock. Through him, I spent time with refugees. I saw the photographs taken by the brave and brilliant Erich Lessing of freedom fighters holding the national flag with a hole in the middle where they had cut out the communist emblem. In numerous shots, grim circles of freedom fighters wearing more or less identical hats and belted coats would be standing assembled round the corpse of an AVH secret policeman who had been lynched. One sequence showed an AVH man hanging by his feet from a tree, his shirt ripped off to display a torso with open wounds. Dieter arranged for someone to drive me to Budapest. At some street corners in the city, the crews of Soviet tanks tried to fraternize with little or no success. Debris was piled high on pavements. Bullets had pockmarked facades, and some shutters were hanging at an angle. A university professor of English literature, almost certainly a secret policeman, attached himself to me and asked if I would like to interview Georgi Lukács. Leftists at Oxford would mention his name with awe as a great innovator of Marxist literary theory. Having supported Imre Nagy in the uprising, he was one of those who arrested and hijacked Romania. On account of his international reputation, he had escaped the firing squad and prison as well. Closeted with me in a dreary, colorless room in central Budapest, he was completely non-committal. I put an end to an unsatisfactory interview by asking why he had a photograph of an elderly Hasid on his desk, his grandfather. Published in 1969, a book called 1956, Counter-Revolution in Hungary, Words and Weapons, is the standard work in defense of the Soviet-imposed regime of János Kádár. The author of this Cold War classic, János Berec, had studied in Moscow and become a member of the Hungarian Party's Central Committee and eventually the ideological secretary. It is not a coincidence that in the Soviet idiom he reverses revolution into counter-revolution and depicts the demand for freedom and independence as reactionary conspiracy. His purpose was to establish that communists have the moral right to shoot their opponents, whereas all who are not communists have no such right. The Soviets in Hungary were therefore virtuous, the British and French and Israelis at Suez vicious. At the time, even Stalinists with closed minds like Palmiro Togliatti and Georges Marchais expressed doubts. Jean-Paul Sartre, a former Soviet apologist, thought that in Hungary the Soviets had been merely, quote, kindling hatred in people's hearts. The attack on Hungary was as difficult for communists to accept as the Hitler-Stalin Pact had been in 1939. At Oxford, the outstanding example was Christopher Hill, the master of Balliol College. After spending the year 1935 in Moscow, he had served in the Foreign Office, the British Foreign Office, that is, rather than the Comintern, as many suspected. Published in 1947, his book of infantile hagiography about Lenin was an act of allegiance. After some hesitation, he appeared to slide out of the party formally, but could not bring himself to condemn outright the use of force in the party's interests. At Cambridge, E.P. Thompson, the historian of the working class, renounced the party, but not the Marxist doctrine that the proletariat are different from everyone else and would inherit the earth. Self-described as a historian, but more realistically a Soviet publicist, E.J. Hobsbawm had a letter published in the Daily Worker on November the 9th, 1956, quote, "While approving with a heavy heart of what is now happening in Hungary, we should also say frankly that we think the USSR should withdraw its troops from the country as soon as this is possible." In a broadcast as recently as 2012, this Commissar Manquet was still advocating mass murder in the interests of communism. The willing surrender to communism of so many men and women, educated and uneducated alike, all over the world, is an integral but mystifying aspect of the 20th century. All sorts of hopes and fears, no doubt, were in play. But in 1956, the reality of Soviet communism destroyed the ideal of equality as a superior social good. Instead, the Hungarian Uprising was irreversible evidence that nationality, culture, human relations, and even happiness itself depend on the supremacy of liberty as a social good. Thank you.